On May 6, 1960, Princess Margaret married Antony Armstrong-Jones before millions of television viewers. 22 days later, Camilla Fry, a woman inside the groom's close social circle, gave birth to a daughter. For decades, Polly Fry was raised as another man's child. Then, 44 years later, a reported DNA test identified Snowdon as her biological father. The science answered one question, but opened several others. Did Margaret know before the wedding? Did anyone inside the palace suspect? And how much did a secret already forming around that marriage shape the years of silence, betrayal, and public scandal that followed? To understand why Margaret was so drawn to Antony Armstrong-Jones, we first need to look at what happened with Peter Townsend. But his story does not need to dominate this one. Margaret had already lived through a romance judged against duty, divorce, religion, and her royal position. By 1955, she publicly announced that she would not marry Townsend. The decision left her with an image that was difficult to escape. The princess who had surrendered a private future to public obligation. That reputation followed her into the second half of the decade. Margaret was glamorous and restless inside a family built around continuity. She moved among artists, actors, and writers more easily than older royal conventions suggested. Yet Townsend remained part of how the public interpreted her. Even when the relationship was over, she was still measured against the love she had not chosen. Antony Armstrong-Jones appeared to belong to another world. He was a photographer with his own career and social confidence, and little of the ceremonial stiffness associated with a traditional courtier. He came from a privileged background, but he did not present himself like a conventional aristocratic husband waiting for a royal role. His work required observation, independence, and access to people from the very different circles. That difference was part of his appeal. Biographers have suggested that Margaret responded to the way Antony treated her as a woman, not merely as a princess. He could be witty and irreverent. He understood the world of portraits and public images, but he also seemed less intimidated by rank than many people around her. After years in which protocol had helped decide what Margaret could not do, a man who resisted protocol could feel like freedom. The same independence contained a warning. A husband of a princess could not remain entirely outside the royal system. He would be ranked, scheduled, and expected to stand behind his wife at public events. The qualities making Antony attractive to Margaret could later make royal life frustrating for him. That tension was present before anyone spoke of divorce, affairs, or mystique. There was also the shadow of Townsend's final departure from Margaret's romantic life. Later accounts say Margaret learned that Townsend intended to marry another woman shortly before deciding to marry Antony. Margaret herself reportedly connected the two events when speaking years later. That does not prove she chose Antony as revenge or consolation. Human decisions are rarely that simple. It does suggest that one door had closed at almost the same moment another seemed ready to open. The engagement was announced in February 1960. Publicly, it offered Margaret a new beginning. The man beside her was creative and socially connected without being a prince. The match seemed to answer the old tragedy with something strikingly different. Yet while the public looked forward to Westminster Abbey, another relationship inside Antony's circle was already becoming important to the story. Jeremy and Camilla Fry were close friends of Antony Armstrong-Jones. They belonged to the same social world in which private relationships could remain private because everyone understood the value of discretion. Jeremy was originally expected to be best man at the royal wedding, though he ultimately withdrew. For this story, the more important fact is simpler. Antony was close to the couple, and Camilla became pregnant during the period when he was moving toward marriage with Margaret. Biographers have described Antony's private life before marriage as complicated and unconventional. Several relationships have been reported, but listing every alleged lover would add heat rather than clarity. Exclusivity, in short, cannot safely be assumed from the public image of his courtship. The social world around Antony contained friendships, intimacies, and loyalties that did not necessarily fit the neat categories presented to newspaper readers. Later writers went further, describing the relationship among Antony, Jeremy, and Camilla as sexually complex. Some accounts have used the language of a three-person relationship. That claim should be handled carefully. The later DNA result can answer a biological question about Polly's father. It cannot reconstruct every agreement, encounter, or understanding among three adults decades earlier. This distinction matters because dramatic versions of the story often collapse several claims into one. If Antony fathered Camilla's child, viewers may assume every rumor about the Fry household must also be true. It does not follow. Biological paternity is one fact. The structure of the adults' relationships is another question. Who knew what? Who consented to what? And what Margaret was told are separate questions again. Camilla's pregnancy created a timeline that would eventually become impossible to ignore. Antony was moving toward a royal marriage while a woman in his intimate social circle was expecting a child. There was no DNA test establishing paternity in 1960. There is also no public document showing Antony formally acknowledged the unborn child before his wedding. That leaves an important gap between what later science established and what anyone could claim with certainty at the time. He may have suspected. Camilla may have known or believed one possibility more strongly than another. Jeremy may have held his own view. Friends may have whispered. But suspicion is not the same as documented knowledge, and the public record does not permit us to stage a secret meeting where everyone agreed on a story. The absence of such a document does not prove nothing was discussed. It simply prevents us from turning possibility into fact. That gap is where the palace question begins. When a commoner was about to marry the queen's sister, how deeply was his private history examined? Did officials hear rumors about the Fry family? Was the pregnancy known to anyone responsible for protecting Margaret from scandal? There is no public evidence showing Buckingham Palace organized a cover-up of Polly's paternity. Yet the timing makes the question understandable because Antony was not merely entering a marriage. He was entering the royal family. The safer reading is narrower than that. Whether Margaret shared that suspicion cannot be established. Nothing in the public record proves she walked into Westminster Abbey knowing that her husband might already have fathered a child with a married friend. That uncertainty changes the emotional stakes. If Margaret knew nothing, she entered the marriage without information that might have influenced her choice. If she knew something but not the full truth, she entered under a different kind of uncertainty. If she knew and accepted it, then the silence says something about the pressures surrounding royal image. Each possibility is powerful. None can responsibly be presented as the answer, but one thing can be dated precisely: the wedding itself. On May 6, 1960, Princess Margaret married Antony Armstrong-Jones at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was televised, turning their private commitment into a national spectacle. The Queen's younger sister appeared to be closing one of the most discussed romantic chapters in modern royal life. Antony, meanwhile, crossed a threshold from fashionable photographer to member of the royal household. The cameras captured what could be seen. They could not capture what remained unresolved among a small circle of friends. That is the central contrast of this story. The wedding was one of the most visible events of the year, while the question that would later transform its meaning remained almost entirely private, and the clock was already running. 22 days after the wedding, on May 28th, Camilla Fry gave birth to Polly. At the time, Polly entered the world as the daughter of Camilla and Jeremy Fry. The label Snowdon's secret daughter belongs to hindsight, because Snowdon's paternity was not publicly established in 1960. The importance of the date is not that everyone knew the secret. It is that the later DNA result would force people to look back at those 22 days differently. The timing is powerful because it requires no embellishment. Margaret and Antony were still in the early weeks of their marriage. Their honeymoon took them through the Caribbean aboard the royal yacht Britannia. Meanwhile, in Britain, a child was born whose biological connection to Antony would remain unresolved in public for more than 4 decades. A story like this invites the idea of an organized pact. Perhaps the adults agreed that Jeremy would be treated as Polly's father. Perhaps friends knew and protected the arrangement. Perhaps royal officials were told and chose silence. Those possibilities have circulated in different forms, but no public record establishes a formal agreement involving the palace. Family secrets often survive without signed instructions. People can preserve uncertainty simply by refusing to ask the question that would make certainty unavoidable. Polly grew up believing Jeremy Fry was her father. That statement deserves more attention than the word scandal usually receives. For the adults, silence could protect marriages, reputations, friendships, or social standing. For a child, the same silence shaped identity. The later revelation would not merely add a footnote to Princess Margaret's marriage. It would alter Polly's understanding of her own family. This is why she should not be treated as a plot device in Margaret's story. Polly did not create the circumstances of her conception. She did not choose the adults' decisions, and she did not cause the royal marriage to fail. The strongest version of this story keeps responsibility with the adults while allowing Polly's eventual search for truth to become the final act. For Margaret and Antony, however, public life moved forward. In 1961, Armstrong-Jones was created Earl of Snowdon. The title did not prove officials knew or did not know anything about Camilla Fry. It reflected his new position as the Queen's brother-in-law and husband of a princess. But later, once Polly's paternity became known, every sign of institutional acceptance naturally attracted retrospective questions. Did the palace conduct inquiries into Antony's private life? Almost certainly some attention would have been paid to the background of a man marrying so close to the throne. Yet the public evidence does not show that officials discovered Polly's paternity and buried it. There is a large difference between social rumors and actionable certainty. In 1960, even those who suspected Antony might have lacked proof. The marriage itself initially seemed to embody something new. Margaret and Snowdon moved through an artistic, fashionable world that felt less formal than earlier royal households. Their circle included photographers, designers, and writers. Publicly, they could be presented as a modern royal couple. He brought professional identity into the marriage instead of becoming only an appendage to her title. But that arrangement contained a contradiction. Snowdon wanted to remain a working photographer. Margaret remained a princess whose rank shaped every room she entered. Public protocol placed him behind her, even when his personality resisted being secondary. The couple could look modern while still living inside a structure built on hierarchy. They also had 2 children together, David and Sarah. Their existence matters because the marriage was not merely a theatrical failure waiting to happen. It created a real family with real loyalties and private bonds that lasted beyond the couple's romantic relationship. Any account that turns Margaret and Snowdon into nothing more than adversaries misses that complexity. Over time, however, strains became increasingly difficult to contain. Snowdon's work took him away. Margaret expected attention and loyalty while carrying the unusual pressures of royal life. Biographies of both figures describe infidelity on each side during different periods. The exact details of every relationship are disputed, and there is little value in turning the script into a catalog of names. The marriage settled into a pattern of parallel lives. It had begun with a public image polished enough for television. Privately, both partners eventually sought intimacy elsewhere. That pattern can tempt us to draw a straight line back to Polly. Did an unresolved secret before the wedding normalize secrecy afterward? It is possible to ask that question, but not to answer it as fact. There is no evidence that Polly's existence caused Margaret and Snowdon's marriage to deteriorate. Their tensions had other documented sources: personality, jealousy, career pressures, royal hierarchy, absences, and later relationships. Looking backward from the DNA result can make every later problem seem like evidence of the first secret. That is precisely the kind of hindsight the record cannot support. Still, one conditional question remains emotionally important. If Snowdon suspected he was Polly's father, then he carried that possibility into the marriage. He would have known that somewhere close to his social world was a child who might one day connect his pre-wedding life to his royal identity. Whether that knowledge weighed on him cannot be established, but the possibility changes how we understand the culture of discretion around him. If Margaret did not know, the imbalance was even sharper. She had already experienced a romance in which public institutions helped define what she could choose. Marriage to Antony was supposed to be a choice made on different terms. If material information about his private life was withheld, then her freedom was incomplete in a way no newspaper could see. If Margaret did know, a different interpretation emerges. Royal marriages have often required silence about uncomfortable private realities. She may have believed a past relationship could remain in the past. She may have accepted uncertainty because certainty would threaten the future she wanted. But there is no evidence strong enough to place those thoughts in her mind, and this account should not pretend otherwise. More concrete evidence exists about the marriage becoming hostile. Friends and biographers have described arguments, humiliations, and cutting remarks. Lady Anne Glenconner, one of Margaret's closest friends, later recalled Snowdon leaving notes that demeaned his wife. Similar claims appear in biographies of the couple. These are reported recollections, not a complete archive from both sides, but they fit a broader record of a relationship that became deeply unhappy. The notes matter because they show private cruelty in a form different from infidelity. An affair can be explained as escape, desire, or distance. A message designed to wound is more direct. Yet even here, motive should not be invented. Was Snowdon trying to control Margaret, punish her, push her toward ending the marriage? Those are interpretations. The record supports the existence of hurtful behavior more strongly than any single explanation for why he used it. Margaret was not a passive figure in every conflict. Accounts of the marriage describe her as demanding, jealous, and capable of cruelty herself. Friends sometimes sided with Snowdon. Others saw Margaret as increasingly isolated and wounded. The marriage became a contest over attention and independence, with both people possessing different kinds of power. Margaret had rank. Snowdon had mobility. She could command deference in public, but he could leave for assignments, enter other social worlds, and control the camera rather than stand before it. That asymmetry helps explain why their conflicts cannot be reduced to a simple villain and victim story. Each had weapons the other did not, yet the public consequences were never equal. A princess's private life was treated as a national subject in a way her husband's often was not. Snowdon's relationships could circulate through society with limited damage to the institution. Margaret's later relationship with Roddy Llewellyn would be captured in photographs and turned into a judgment on her character. That imbalance would become one of the marriage's final ironies. The public eventually saw evidence of Margaret's relationship. It did not yet know about Polly. The most visible scandal would belong to the princess, while one of the most consequential secrets predated the wedding itself. By the early 1970s, Margaret and Snowdon were living increasingly separate lives. The modern royal marriage that had once seemed fresh now carried the familiar signs of distance, absences, resentments, and a public image harder to maintain. Their children remained part of both parents' lives, but the partnership itself was weakening. Biographers have written extensively about Snowdon's affairs, just as Margaret's relationships have been examined repeatedly. The temptation is to keep score, as though the marriage can be judged by counting betrayals. That approach misses the more revealing point. Snowdon had greater freedom to conduct a professional and private life beyond the palace, while Margaret's identity followed her everywhere. When she crossed a boundary, the boundary crossed into public debate. The reports of hurtful notes left for Margaret fit this period of deterioration. Lady Glenconner later described Snowdon as capable of making comments intended to undermine the princess's confidence. Other biographies recount similarly cutting exchanges. These accounts come from people around the couple and should not be treated as transcripts of every private conflict. They do, however, reinforce the picture of a marriage where argument had become personal. It is easy to look at that cruelty and search for a hidden cause. Perhaps Snowdon resented royal restrictions. Perhaps he resented Margaret's rank. Perhaps the secrets of his earlier life taught him to divide affection into separate compartments. Each idea is plausible, but none is necessary to explain the evidence. A marriage can become destructive through ordinary human failures, without one concealed event controlling everything. That is important when Polly returns to the story. The existence of a biological daughter before the wedding may reveal something about Snowdon's capacity for secrecy. It does not prove that he entered the marriage intending to deceive Margaret forever, nor does it prove that every later affair was an extension of the same decision. Patterns can be meaningful without becoming a single cause. Margaret, meanwhile, began a relationship with Roddy Llewellyn, a younger landscape gardener she met in the early 1970s. By then, her marriage was already in serious difficulty. The relationship offered newspapers something they could finally show rather than merely report. In 1976, photographs of Margaret and Llewellyn on Mustique were published, turning private breakdown into public spectacle. The pictures mattered because they simplified a complicated marriage into a single visible image. Readers did not need to understand years of mutual infidelity, hostility, or distance. They saw the Queen's sister beside another man. The press could build a moral story around a photograph, and Margaret became the easiest person to place at its center. There is no public evidence that Snowdon arranged or leaked those photographs. Later suspicion has sometimes tried to give him a direct role because he benefited from the shift in public blame, but benefit is not proof of orchestration. More plausibly, the images simply exposed Margaret's relationship and accelerated a crisis already underway. The couple announced their separation shortly afterward. 2 years later, in 1978, the marriage was dissolved. The divorce itself was historically notable because a senior royal marriage ending formally still carried exceptional symbolic weight. Yet even at that stage, the public record of the marriage remained incomplete. Margaret's relationship with Roddy was visible. Snowdon's affairs were discussed in society and biographies, but they rarely carried the same constitutional or moral symbolism. Polly's paternity remained outside the public story, so the marriage entered history with an imbalance. The princess's scandal had photographs, while the groom's pre-wedding secret had no scientific proof. That imbalance shaped reputation. Margaret could be portrayed as the woman who broke the marriage because the camera had caught her with someone else. Snowdon could appear injured even while accounts of his own relationships circulated. The press did not invent every problem, but it selected the problem that produced the strongest image. This is where Snowdon's profession adds a bitter layer. He understood images better than almost anyone around the royal family. His career depended on framing people, deciding what entered the picture, and controlling what remained outside it. There is no evidence he controlled the Mustique photographs, but the marriage itself became an example of how framing can determine public memory. For years, the frame contained Margaret, Roddy, Mustique, and divorce. It did not contain Camilla Fry giving birth 22 days after the wedding, or Polly growing up as Jeremy Fry's daughter. Nor did it contain the biological question that would eventually force Snowdon back into the story from a completely different direction. Polly's absence from the public narrative also reminds us how differently secrets operate across generations. The adults could move on, remarry, build careers, or maintain silence. A child carries the unanswered question simply by existing. Even if nobody speaks about it, resemblance, family rumor, and social knowledge can keep uncertainty alive. According to later reporting, Polly eventually heard persistent suggestions that Snowdon, not Jeremy Fry, might be her biological father. Her decision to seek an answer was therefore not merely curiosity about royal gossip. It concerned the most basic fact of personal identity: who was her father? The question also placed her in a difficult moral position. Seeking certainty could alter her relationship with the man who had raised her. It could expose her mother's private life. It could attach her name permanently to one of Britain's most famous royal marriages, yet refusing to ask would leave other people's silence in control of her own history. Polly later described the discovery as difficult because Jeremy had been the father she loved and idealized. That distinction is essential. Biological paternity does not erase social parenthood. A DNA result can identify genetic connection, but it cannot rewrite childhood or cancel affection. The truth she sought could therefore be both clarifying and painful. By the early 2000s, genetic testing offered something unavailable in 1960. It could move the question beyond resemblance, rumor, and competing memories. The result would not tell Polly what Camilla had believed during pregnancy. It would not reveal what Jeremy knew. It would not reconstruct conversations between Snowdon and Margaret. But it could answer one narrow question with extraordinary force. In 2004, Polly sought DNA testing involving Snowdon. Later accounts, including major obituaries, reported that the result identified Antony Armstrong-Jones as her biological father. Snowdon initially denied public knowledge of the test when the story emerged, while Jeremy Fry rejected the claim. Later reporting stated that Snowdon eventually accepted the truth of the paternity. That sequence deserves care because it was not a theatrical confession delivered at the moment of testing. Public accounts unfolded over time. Polly said the test gave her an answer. Early responses challenged or distanced Snowdon from the story. Later, biographical and obituary accounts treated his paternity as established. Polly Fry was Snowdon's biological daughter. That much the later record consistently supports. But the test could not reveal who knew the truth in 1960. That limit is more important than it first appears. DNA can identify a father, it cannot date a suspicion, and it cannot prove whether Snowdon was certain before his wedding or that Margaret was told. It cannot show whether Jeremy knowingly accepted a social fatherhood while suspecting another biological father. And it certainly cannot prove Buckingham Palace conducted a formal cover-up. Once the paternity became known, however, the wedding timeline changed permanently. May 6th and May 28th could never again be viewed as unrelated dates. A royal marriage had taken place, and less than a month later, the groom's biological daughter had been born into another household. That is confirmed by later evidence, even if the knowledge surrounding it at the time remains uncertain. The result also changes the moral center of the story. It would be easy to make Margaret the principal victim because she was the famous princess, but Polly had lived with the consequence more directly. Margaret's possible ignorance is an unanswered question. Polly's delayed knowledge is documented reality. For 44 years, the question of Polly's father remained unresolved publicly. She was the person who eventually demanded an answer. The truth did not emerge because the palace opened a file, because a newspaper proved a conspiracy, or because Snowdon volunteered a public confession. It emerged because the daughter, at the center of the uncertainty, chose to ask science what the adults around her had never settled openly. The later discovery did not transform every rumor into truth. Some writers had described Antony, Jeremy, and Camilla as part of an unusually intimate social arrangement. The paternity result made one element of those stories more credible, because Antony and Camilla had clearly shared a relationship capable of producing a child. But it did not prove the full structure described by later biographers. DNA does not authenticate gossip beyond the question it actually answers. The same discipline must apply to Margaret. No public evidence shows she was told before the wedding that Camilla's child might be Antony's. There is no documented confrontation, no verified letter in which she accepts the situation, and no reliable record of the Queen being asked to approve a concealment. To say Margaret must have known is to replace evidence with intuition. The palace claim is weaker still. Royal households care deeply about reputation, and background inquiries were part of protecting the institution. That makes it reasonable to ask what officials heard about Antony's private life. It does not establish that they discovered Polly's paternity and suppressed it. A missing document is not evidence that a document was destroyed, and social silence is not automatically a palace order. The record supports something more human and in some ways more unsettling. Antony Armstrong-Jones married Princess Margaret, while Camilla Fry was close to giving birth to a child he had fathered. Polly was born 22 days after the wedding. She grew up within the Fry family and learned the biological truth decades later through reported DNA testing. Snowdon's later acceptance placed the matter beyond ordinary society rumor. The marriage that followed was complicated for reasons larger than Polly. Margaret and Snowdon had 2 children together and built a real family before their relationship deteriorated. Both were associated with affairs. Friends described deep hostility and cruel exchanges. Margaret's relationship with Roddy Llewellyn became public through the Moustique photographs, and the couple separated before divorcing in 1978. There is no evidence Polly caused that collapse. She should never be made responsible for choices adults made before her birth and after it, but her existence exposes something about the marriage's starting conditions. Even before the vows were exchanged, Snowdon's private life contained realities the public image did not show. Whether Margaret knew those realities remains the unresolved part. That distinction changes how the famous wedding photograph looks today. It does not become proof that everyone in the picture was participating in a lie. It becomes evidence of how little a public ceremony can tell us about private knowledge. Millions could watch a princess marry, yet none of that visibility could answer what was happening inside a small circle of adults. The later treatment of Margaret makes the contrast sharper. When her own relationship became photographable, she was judged in public. Politicians questioned her position. Newspapers made her private life a national argument, and the collapse of her marriage became attached to her image. Snowdon's biological connection to Polly remained outside that public reckoning for decades. That does not erase Margaret's choices or excuse her affairs. It does reveal how scandal depends on evidence becoming visible at the right moment. Margaret had photographs. Snowdon had silence, and it was the photographs people remembered. Polly's DNA result shifted that balance without rewriting the whole marriage. It confirmed a fact that had been hidden inside rumor. It did not confirm a palace conspiracy, Margaret's prior knowledge, or a formal pact among the Fry household. The strongest conclusion is therefore narrower than the most sensational version, but also more defensible. Confirmed. Margaret and Antony married on May 6, 1960. Polly Fry was born on May 28th. Later DNA reporting identified Snowdon as her biological father, and later accounts recorded his acceptance of that truth. Margaret and Snowdon separated in 1976 and divorced in 1978. Reported but harder to prove in full, the exact nature of Antony's relationship with Camilla and Jeremy Fry, the extent of knowledge within their social circle, and the most damaging private exchanges inside the royal marriage. Those claims require attribution because memory, biography, and society rumor are not the same as scientific evidence. Unproven that Margaret knew before her wedding, that Buckingham Palace discovered and buried Polly's paternity, that Snowdon married Margaret specifically to conceal the pregnancy, or that he engineered the Moustique photographs. Each claim can make a dramatic story. None is required to understand the confirmed one. And the confirmed story is already extraordinary. A wedding watched by millions took place 22 days before the groom's biological daughter was born into another family. The child at the center of that secret then had to wait more than 4 decades for a scientific answer. The question that remains isn't whether Polly belonged in the story, but why the truth about her place in it took so long to become hers. Who do you think knew the truth in 1960, and how much should Margaret have been told before she married? Share your view in the comments. If you value royal stories that separate documented fact from rumor, please like this video, subscribe to the Palace Circle, and join us as we examine another private truth behind a very public royal image.